How can we find security in an uncertain world? If you want to have some fun, then what I suggest is you go to people's social media and you look at what they were saying on New Year's Day 2020. In almost every instance, it didn't age well. Because the reality is that none of us had any idea what was going to happen last year. It's no surprise then, at the beginning of 2021, people had a bit more humility in the kind of predictions they were making about the future. We've all had to get used to the fact that we don't know what the future holds. It used to be if you wanted to ask someone a difficult question, you would say something like this: what do you think is going to happen when you die? Whereas these days, if you want to ask someone a difficult question, you just have to say, what do you think is going to happen next week? The reality is, none of us know. We've got used to living with uncertainty, and although we've had to get used to it, I wouldn't say it's got any easier, has it? Because one of the problems of uncertainty is that we never quite know what we can look forward to. Will we be able to see family by Easter? Will we be able to go on a foreign holiday in the summer? Will we even have a job to be able to graduate to? We just don't know what the future holds. And with nothing certain in the future, it seems that life has become devoid of hope and security. It's no surprise, therefore, that when Matt Hancock spoke about the successful vaccine trials, he talked about injecting hope into our arms. Yeah, I probably want to suggest that the hope that most of us had was a little bit more than sitting on a park bench and drinking a coffee with one other person. But here's the thing. Before we blame all of life's uncertainties on COVID, we have to remember that life has actually always been uncertain. We've never fully known what the future holds. The best laid plans can be scuppered by unforeseen events. The best relationships can tragically come to an end through divorce or death. The best of jobs will end either with redundancy or retirement. And the best of health will ultimately come to an end one day too. Nothing in life is certain. We've never known what the future really holds. So if life is ultimately so uncertain, where can we find real security? Well, to answer that question, I want us to look at some words that were written by one of the early Christian leaders and are recorded today within the words of the New Testament. They were written by a man called the Apostle Paul. And there's a couple of things worth noting about his life before we look at what he wrote in particular. Firstly, Paul hadn't always been a Christian believer. In fact, before his dramatic conversion to Christianity, he had opposed the very faith that he was now proclaiming. He was almost a first-century terrorist in his violent retributions that he meted out upon the other followers of Jesus Christ. His was a radical life transformation. But the second thing that's worth noting is that embracing the Christian faith, on the surface at least, hadn't made Paul's life more secure, but less. Now his life was filled with great uncertainties as he faced being socially ostracized and physically persecuted for his faith in Christ. In another place, he wrote this about his experience of being a Christian. He said this: "I have been in prison. I have been flogged. 5 times I received the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have laboured and toiled, and often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked." The reality is, for Paul, embracing the Christian faith hadn't made his life easier. It actually made it harder. And that is the same for many Christians around the world today. According to a recent report in the Independent newspaper, 100,000 Christians each year will be killed for their faith. So Christianity doesn't give us a pass to having a simple life where everything goes the way we want it to. But Paul does, in the context of all that, speak of the incredible security that he has discovered as a Christian. Let me read some incredible words that he wrote while in prison, facing possibility of execution. In the midst of all of that uncertainty, he was able to make this incredible claim. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Wrapped up in those 11 words are the secrets to the security that Paul had discovered as a Christian. And it's that secret that we can discover as well. He says to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Firstly, he says to live is Christ. Christianity ultimately is all about Christ. The clue is in the name, isn't it? Someone once said if you take Christ out of Christian, you're left with 3 letters, I-A-N, and Ian can't help you. Now that would be a really cheesy joke, so I won't use it, but it kind of makes the point, doesn't it? Christianity is not so much about a system of belief. It's not about a ritual. It's not about a building. It is about a person. It's about encountering a relationship with God through the person of Jesus. And that is exactly what Paul had come to experience. But he was blown away by that, because if there was anyone less deserving of a relationship with God, according to Paul, it was himself. He had spent his life opposing God and opposing the Christian faith, and yet here he was enjoying the love of God for him in Jesus. But that's the point. This relationship that Paul is speaking about is not a relationship that we deserve, nor is it a relationship we could ever earn through our religious rituals and behaviour. It is a relationship that we can receive because of the free gift of God's love to us in Jesus. Paul had come to discover that though he didn't deserve this relationship, God in Jesus had died for him, taking the punishment for the wrong that he had done so that he could be forgiven, so that he could know this God and know his love. And Paul knew as a result of that whatever happened to him in life, there was one thing that could never be taken away. He could never lose that relationship with God. We might lose our health. We may lose our jobs. We may lose our relationships. But if you know God in Christ, you will never lose that. It is a strong foundation. It is with a God who promises to be with us no matter what, who says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Can I ask, do you know the security of having a real relationship with a God who's promised to be with you no matter what through every season of life? You can. Paul says, for me to live is Christ. Secondly, he says, to die is gain. Now, I know many of us don't think a great deal about death, living particularly in the 21st century West. And yet it would be a good thing to do, wouldn't it? I mean, statistically, 1 out of 1 people die. So given that this is going to happen to all of us someday, somehow, it's worth thinking about what might or might not lie beyond. And I guess most people like to think that there is something beyond death, that death isn't the end. But if we're really honest, what really excites us is not this ephemeral view of some kind of eternal choir practice where we sit on a cloud and play harps for all eternity. What really excites us is this life, this real physical world in which we live. We might be happy to think that people go on living in some form beyond death, but this is the real deal. This is where we think things are at. And that's why Paul's words there are so remarkable, aren't they? Because they don't merely suggest that there might be something beyond death, but Paul is able to say, to die is gain. In other words, that whatever lies beyond death is even better and more real than the experience of life that we are having here and now. And that is because Paul had discovered what is offered in Jesus to those who trust him. And that is not that we will one day escape from this world and go off to some spiritual paradise to play those harps on those clouds. But actually what is promised in the Christian faith is the renewal and transformation of all things. The Bible doesn't so much speak about us going to heaven, but heaven coming to earth and transforming it. It talks about a whole new creation. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford professor who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, described life now merely as the Shadowlands by way of contrast to that ultimate future that the Christian can look forward to. To die is gain. When we hear about this idea of Christian hope, we might be tempted to think, well, isn't it just a psychological crutch? Don't people believe those kind of things just because they want it to be true? Well, certainly, when it comes to the Apostle Paul, I'd have to say the opposite was actually the case. Paul did not embrace the Christian faith because he desired it to be true. In fact, he desired it not to be true. He embraced it because he was convinced it was true, because he encountered the risen Jesus. His hope in the future was not based on his emotional desires. It was based on his objective belief in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. You might say, but how can I believe the resurrection? I remember talking to one student and he heard of the resurrection of Jesus and he said to me, oh, come on, things like that don't happen every day. To which I said, well, yeah, that's the whole point. They don't, do they? And it is the unique and stupendous claim of the resurrection of Jesus that sets Christianity apart and at very least should motivate us to look at it. But you might say, we now know, though, that things like that can't happen. But to that, I'd want to point out that it doesn't take a degree in the natural sciences from the University of Cambridge to know that dead people normally stay dead. People knew that 2,000 years ago just as much as we know that today. They didn't believe in the resurrection because it was somehow more plausible according to their worldview and presuppositions. They believed it because they were convinced it was true. But you might say, well, I just don't have enough faith to believe that kind of stuff. But what kind of faith are you wanting? I remember getting my haircut a while back, back in the days when it was legally allowed in this country to get one's haircut by someone other than oneself. And my hairdresser, she was talking to me and she discovered that I was a Christian, that I wrote books and I gave talks. And she said to me, I really admire your faith. And I thought that was a bit of a compliment. So I said to her, what do you think faith is? And she looks at me in the mirror as she does, and she says, well, faith is the ability to believe things that aren't true. And I think for a moment and I look at her in the mirror and I say, do you admire my ability to believe things that aren't true? And then I went on and said, because I think I would pity people that have that kind of ability, don't you? You see, faith is not the ability to believe things that aren't true, or even the ability to summon up one's courage to believe things against the evidence, or in spite of the lack of evidence. But Christian faith, at very least, is basing your trust on something that you are persuaded is true because of the evidence. So you might say, what is the evidence, therefore, that Jesus actually did rise from the dead? A friend of mine was a student at the University of Bristol, and during his time there, the Christian Union organised one Easter a big event called the Great Resurrection Debate. They took out a centre-page spread in the student newspaper and offered a £500 cash prize to the student who could come up with the best explanation to explain away the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. They then outlined some of those pieces of evidence with some extra sources and reading that people could do if they so wished. They looked at the evidence that was generally agreed upon, not just by Christian scholars, but atheist and Jewish scholars as well. The fact, for instance, that Jesus was crucified. The fact that the tomb was found to be empty after 3 days. The fact that Jesus' disciples were convinced that they had encountered him again after his death, alive. And then the fact that Christianity spread dramatically right across the Roman world in the following decades, all based on this claim of resurrection. The entrants were then shortlisted, and those people were then invited to present their case at a cheese and wine evening at the Student Union. A local High Court judge was invited to adjudicate. And when he did, two very interesting things happened. Firstly, the student who received his award said in his closing remarks that he himself wasn't actually that convinced about the argument that he had given. He had tried to suggest that somehow Jesus hadn't really died on the cross, had revived in the tomb, and people mistook his resuscitation for a resurrection. But he went on to say, although he wasn't convinced by his own arguments, he was very happy to have the £500. Thank you very much. But then secondly, the High Court judge in his closing remarks said that none of the explanations that have been submitted so far would have stood up in a court of law. All of them would have been thrown out because none of them satisfactorily explained the evidence. But then in the weeks after that event, something else interesting happened as well. The student who had won the £500 cash prize investigated further the claims of the resurrection and became convinced they were true and became a committed Christian himself. You see, as ridiculous as it might seem to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, when you start to look at the historical evidence, the more compelling it actually becomes. You see, Paul was able to say to live is Christ and to die is gain. It wasn't a psychological crutch. It was based on his hope and belief in the resurrection of Jesus. And that ultimately can give us incredible security in the face of all of life's uncertainties and in the face of death itself. So what difference does this make? Well, let me say this. If Jesus Christ is really risen from the dead, then we can learn to say with Paul, to live is Christ and to die is gain. In other words, we can have a security in the midst of an uncertain world that is strong, a foundation that is utterly secure, something that can never be taken away. And we can know that whatever happens in life, the best is yet to come. And this isn't just wishful thinking, it's true. Not too good to be true, but so good because it is true. I'll never forget a phone call I got just a couple of years ago from a friend of mine. And I could tell from her voice that she was broken. Her daughter, in her mid-20s, had been battling cancer for the last year. Just a couple of weeks before this, she had heard that the cancer was in remission, that she was free to go back to normal life. And yet, just 2 weeks later, she'd been called back in with the devastating news that actually it had spread. And now it was terminal. And for the next year, we watched as she bravely fought that cancer until tragically, just at the beginning of last year, she died. But she documented her journey through social media, and I was struck by the amazing confidence and security that she had, even as she faced the reality of her own impending mortality. Just a few days after receiving that tragic news, she wrote these words. This isn't the news I thought I would be sharing, 3 weeks and finding out that my scans were clear. But the reality of life means that unfortunately it is. And then she went on. My wise daddy said this to me in the moments after we got this news. It was never meant to be about this life anyway. This is just a blip on the road to eternity, and we're all just passing through. I'm confident that heaven will be infinitely better, and I'm excited to see Jesus face to face. You see, this kind of hope and security is real. It can give security in the face of death itself. It can give you the strongest foundation in life. And my question to you is, do you know that security? Do you know that confidence for yourself? Or you might be saying, well, I don't believe this. I think it is rubbish. I'm not convinced. But if that's the case, can I say, how will you explain away the historical evidence for Jesus? Have you even looked into it? Have you checked out the historical evidence for yourself? At very least do that before you walk away from it and write it off. Maybe you're saying, well, actually, I'm intrigued, but I'd like to find out more because I'm not yet convinced. Well, if what we've said over these 3 weeks has the possibility of being true, isn't it worth investigating for yourself? Because this is of infinite importance. The Christian Union exists to help you investigate those questions, and we'd love to continue that conversation. But maybe you actually would like to respond, to receive this security and this foundation, this confidence for yourself. And the wonderful thing is, you can. This same Jesus who encountered Paul 2,000 years ago, who encountered me 30 years ago, can encounter you today. As you invite him to come into your life, he can not only connect you with the God who made you, but he can give you the confident security that he will be with you through life, through death and eternity. And that because of him, the best is yet to come. Why not invite him to come into your life, to get rid of all the stuff that's wrong, to bring his forgiveness, to bring his new life, and to give you that kind of security and foundation? Why not speak to him today and invite him to do that for you?